Welcome to Sovereign Finance, the show that connects the dots between personal finance, global finance trends, and deep human history. Tune in every week to demystify the money puzzle and protect your interests in a turbulent world. Welcome to this episode of Sovereign Finance. I'm your host, Rob Drummond, here with Derek Dearden. How's it going, Derek?
It's going well, thanks, Rob. And you?
Yeah, good, thanks. So we are here today to talk about wealth, everybody's favourite topic, but we felt like we needed an episode to really dig down on what actually is wealth. And that's our topic today. So where do we need to go first?
Right, well, let's first of all think about what people normally conceive of as wealth. Normally they think of things like real estate, property, houses to rent, house that you live in yourself, perhaps land, shares, perhaps life insurance policies and pension plans, things like that. But let's have a look at what these actually represent if we dig down into them. And also, what we need to do is have a look at the way that wealth is created and the way that it also goes out of existence. So, as I say, that's normally it. Now, what have these things got in common? What they've got in common is that they're all things that people want. And if there's something that people want at one point in time, like, say, at one point there was a big phase for hula hoops. They come round and a hula hoop will have a certain sort of value. Then when the fad passes, it goes away. Nobody wants them, and so it has no value.
When I was growing up, it was all about those little Tamagotchis that used to bleep.
Yes.
And they were quite hard to get hold of for a while.
Yeah. And if you had them now, yeah, you can give them away. Okay, so let's have a look at the mechanics of what it is that people want. And I think a good place to start with this is with Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of human needs. He wrote a book in the 1950s where he expounded this idea that human beings have a variety of needs. And at the base level, there are physiological needs, the needs for shelter, food, water, clothing. And if you haven't got those, it's the highest possible priority to get those. There's no doubt about that. And above that, you've got a need for safety and security. And once you know that you're not going to expire in the next 24 hours for lack of water or food, you want to know that you're safe. You want to know that you're not going to be preyed on by wild animals or burglars or bandits. And so that's the next level. And then above that, there are social needs, needs for belonging, needs for love, needs for friendship. Above that, there is a need for what he called esteem, both self-esteem and the respect of other people. And then on the layer at the top of that, in his original version, he had what he called self-actualization. And self-actualization was regarded as whatever you individually choose to pursue once you have all those other things behind. And his original concept was that you needed each layer to be in place before you could really focus your attention on what's above. So you could ask yourself, well, where do you have desires within this framework? Which of those desires are already met, and which of ones are you dealing with, and how do you get those? And so if you look at it for yourself, that's one thing. If you're in business and you have customers or clients, you can see what it is that they want, and what in what way you can satisfy that desire, and then what the way that you satisfy that desire is a form of wealth, how you can create that, and how they would receive that and how they would value it.
I was just thinking as well that some of these levels in Maslow's hierarchy, I think, have been under attack in recent years as well. When you think about the COVID lockdowns, for instance, we were prevented from meeting up, from socializing, from having connections. There was this concept of feeling threatened and not feeling safe, which may have been real, maybe not, but that was the feeling that was projected, I think, onto people. And I think it just struck me as you were talking, actually, that perhaps our wealth at different levels was under attack at that point.
Yes, and indeed, wealth in a very tangible sense was under attack. The moment that those policies were introduced, I thought, well, apart from anything else, there are a lot of small businesses which are going to be under attack. They're not going to have the resources to survive this. And it was plain that the kind of emergency measures that the government was bringing in to support people were not the ones that would be done if you were serious about preserving people's independence. And this is exactly what's happened. I mean, I think I've no idea what the actual numbers are, but I would imagine that something like 90% of independent um, businesses, certainly, for instance, in the catering trade, pubs and restaurants, closed their doors. And if they ever opened again, it would be because they'd been bought up by large conglomerates who had the financial resources to weather that storm.
Yeah,
And
to buy the assets quite cheaply, I guess.
yeah, absolutely. So um, let's have a look at the way that uh, wealth is created. If you take something simple and tangible, like for instance furniture, that's clearly something that people want. You could say it's a form of wealth, it's part of your assets. If you haven't got furniture, you would want to get hold of some. And how is that brought into existence? You might have an independent craftsman who works as a carpenter. He takes planks of wood, he machines them and fits them together, and you end up with chairs and tables and so forth. Now, there's a few things to note about that. One is that it requires energy to do that. It requires his muscular power if he's working with hand tools, or electrical power if he's got machine tools that he uses. And there is always some application of energy applied to the process of bringing physical artifacts into existence from raw materials. And the reason that we need energy, as everybody knows, energy is neither created nor destroyed. But on the other hand, there is a great desire for us to find coal to run power stations, or diesel fuel or petrol to run vehicles, and all these things. And this is constantly needing to be mined and replenished. And why is that if energy is not created or destroyed? It's because in the process of utilizing that energy, a portion of it is wasted. For instance, when you drive your car, the energy which exists in the world as a whole is exactly the same as at the starting point, but the energy that was stored in the gasoline that went into the fuel tank, now that's been used up. Some of it's used in moving the vehicle from one place to another, and some of it goes out as heat out of the exhaust pipe and off the brake discs and out of the radiator. And at the end of the day, the car comes to a standstill and that's no longer moving. And that's a quantity called entropy, which can be seen as the tendency of some energy becoming unavailable to do useful work with. It can also be seen as a, a disordering of physical objects. We all know that iron rusts, that wood rots, and there's a general process of decay.
Houses decay, things fall down, things break.
Yep, yep. And of course, there is on the face of it an exception to this in the processes of life. If you look at an egg, it starts in a fairly amorphous form. The chick takes its form inside the egg from that amorphous yolk and egg white. But this doesn't actually violate that physical law of increasing entropy, because in doing that, the chemical reactions produce heat, it warms the air around it, and the warmth of the air is random movement, which is disordered energy which is no longer able to use. So it balances out. And similarly, when we perform work to do something, the heat that we produce causes more disorder than the order that we impose on the artifacts that we're making.
So, like, it might appear that we're creating order out of chaos, but the chaos is in fact still there. It's just that you're left with something that you can see, and that thing has perceived value to people.
And of course, this comes down to the question about the fact that the wealth which is created is in need of replenishment at greater or lesser rate. If you take something um, like a house, it gets built, it's in good shape. It requires some kind of maintenance to prevent it falling into disrepair, and after various lengths of time, it will eventually need replacing entirely. But this could be after hundreds of years, depending on the way that the building's been made and how well it's looked after. So some forms of wealth, the wealth that we most often think of, is what I would call enduring wealth. Uh, it's wealth that persists over time, and buildings would be a good example of that. Machinery could be that. I mean, my wife's got an etching press, which is about 130 years old, and it still works as well as the day that it came out of the factory, and it probably worked for another 130 years. And one of the things that we should be maybe thinking about is making our so-called consumer durables to be rather more durable. We touched on that in the episode that we did about gross national product um, and its unsatisfactory aspects as a measure of human well-being. And then other forms of wealth are necessarily transient. For instance, food is obviously something we desire, and the food only lasts as long as until you've eaten it. Similarly, some forms, in this broad definition of things that people want, one example might be services. You might want somebody to come and clean your house for you, but as soon as they've finished cleaning it, it gradually accumulates the need for further attention.
Some things I think are also just a liability. Like, my wife and I both ride motorbikes, and we do want to get a new motorbike. But obviously, if you buy the thing outright, it devalues by about a third as soon as you drive it off the lot, and then it gradually decreases in value over time. Or you don't even own it; you just lease it from the bank, basically. So it's a cost. It's not wealth. It's actually, I mean, it is wealth because it gives us enjoyment and it gives us pleasure, but it's not wealth in the sense of how we said people often think about wealth.
There's another aspect of this equation which can be missed if we look at purely numerical values, and that is that some of the things which are created, which people do want, for instance, people want weapons ammunition. Some people do. I don't.
Some people do. Yeah, I'm starting to think that I do, but
Well, let's hope not.
I'll keep my longbow handy. Yeah, you never know.
So, John Ruskin, the 19th century commentator, um, coined the term "ilf," which means the opposite of wealth. I mean, the word wealth, in its etymological root, comes from the word well, and so wealth, in one sense, in its original meaning, meant the quality of being well, and
We seem to have maybe gone quite a long way from that route.
exactly, indeed. Anyway, so with a bit of a play on words, Ruskin suggested that negative wealth, um, things that actually reduce the well-being of humanity, should be described as ilf. And some of those, of course, are things that are actually created, such as we've just indicated, weapons and ammunition. And other things are the side effects of producing wealth, the pollution which is created, and the running down of resources. And once again, if you go back to enduring wealth, probably the most enduring form of all is land. But once again, that can be degraded. It can be turned from a desert if unsound farming practices are applied to it. But on the other hand, if it's done in harmony with the natural cycles, there's no reason why the land shouldn't remain productive in perpetuity.
Perhaps it's also possible to become wealthy by engaging in some damaging practices that are not beneficial to the people around you necessarily.
Have you got any particular examples in mind?
Well, I mean, obviously, if you go back to the idea of land, if you've pushed someone else off that land to begin with, then that isn't contributing necessarily to a status of well-being. I think.
Yes. Well, exactly. This actually comes down to the concept that there are, in fact, two ways of acquiring wealth. One is to create it, and maybe to trade what you've created in the way of one form of wealth for another form, and the other is essentially to steal it. And that can be a very crude way of doing it. And obviously, the process of stealing it doesn't create any new wealth, it just transfers it from one person to the other. And that could be quite straightforward, like holding somebody up with a gun or a knife, or sneaking into their house and taking their possessions when they're not there. Uh, or it could be far more subtle, as we've seen in, for instance, the operations of the banking system that we will go into in more detail in another episode. But uh, there are there are all manner of activities going on in the world where no new wealth is being created, but some people are ending up owning it, and other people are ending up uh, that much poorer.
Do we need to have a transition back to? I say back to a transition to a world where more of the wealth that is built up is created and traded ethically rather than just transferred.
I think that is absolutely the case.
I mean, we're both involved in the small business world, and that seems to be the ethos behind small business. And perhaps, it's one of the reasons maybe that I'm involved in that space.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. I think everybody operating a small business, unless it's an outright swindle of some sort, uh, is in the business of providing something which is of genuine value to somebody else.
Yeah, you can't be in a small business and not touch on the wealth creation process. Whereas you can work for a government agency or a big company and be quite removed, I think, from wealth creation if it's even happening.
Yeah, and I mean, whenever anybody does operate some kind of new enterprise which is not providing value, it's a matter of time before people realise this and it runs out of road. And I just wanted to say that, as we said in the money episode, money is not wealth itself. Money is a claim on wealth.
It's perhaps a liquid expression, isn't it? Like it's the easiest thing to go. It's the easiest thing to go out and trade for other stuff. Whereas the wealth in your house, it's quite hard to go and buy groceries with that. I mean, it's possible in theory, but much harder to do so.
There's an interesting reflection on this in people's attitude to selling. There's a sort of feeling that the process of selling is some kind of competition or tournament where the winner is the person who makes the sale. Now, assuming that it's actually a fair transaction, that it's not something which is basically fraudulent. Assuming that it's a fair transaction, uh, insofar as there's a winner and a loser, the winner is really the buyer, because if it's been an ethical conversation, the buyer had an unmet want or an unmet need, and what he buys meets that need and satisfies it. And the person who sells it, on the other hand, has only got money, and the money itself has no intrinsic value until he takes that money and and exchanges that in turn for something that he actually wants or needs. And throughout history, there's been this phenomenon of people who were in love with money as a thing in itself. They were called misers. And now you have people who have taken that to a preposterous degree. And if we look in the world around us, we'll see the wealthiest people who are, you know, in society at large, regarded by a lot of people as highly successful and admirable and to be emulated. But in fact, I would say that anybody who continues accumulating money, especially at enormous cost to other people, which is certainly what's going on at the moment, they're not to be admired at all. They're suffering from some kind of psychological abnormality.
But that's rewarded by our society, isn't it? So you get people at the top who love money and use people, and I think what we're saying is that we should be using money and loving people.
Yep, exactly
It
so.
should, it should be the reverse.
And coming back to Abraham Maslow, he revisited that idea of the hierarchy of human needs about 20 years later, towards the end of his life, and he wrote another book called "The Farther Shores of Human Nature," and no, the farther reaches of human nature, and he hadn't quite finished it at the time of his death in I think 1972, but it was edited and posthumously published. And in that, he created a new level at the top of that hierarchy, above the self actualization level, and he called that transcendence. And the way he defined transcendence was: transcendence refers to the very highest and most inclusive or holistic levels of human consciousness, behaving and relating as ends rather than means to oneself, to significant others, to human beings in general, to other species, to nature, and to the cosmos. And that was a concept which I think some people already interpreted under the heading of the previous top level of self actualization. But that makes it explicit that it's entirely different from anything which is, if you like, directed towards satisfying our sense of individuality and towards seeing ourselves as integrated with the rest of humanity, and seeing therefore that putting one over on other people and exploiting them is in fact destructive to our own well-being, and indeed that the same applies to our interactions with nature.
I think otherwise self actualization promotes the idea that you could just be living solo in a huge mansion with a legion of servants serving you,
Some people would interpret it that way, yeah.
then you're out of connection with humanity. You're out of connection with the natural world. Yeah, there's a consciousness link that is broken. I think in that model.
And if we are going to pull through as a human global society through the crisis period that we're undoubtedly living in at the moment, if we're going to pull through to something more positive, more harmonious, that has got to be something which is, I would say, universally understood. And I, one of the things that gives me hope is my perception may may not be accurate, I don't know, but my perception is that more people in the world today are pursuing that in one form or another. There is more interest in that than there is in one form or another. And not only that, I would say that over the past few decades, there are more and more people who recognize that we're not all going to approach it in the same way, through the same mechanisms, through the same doctrines and religions, and that other people's approach to transcendence is equally valid. Whether we'll do that in time before the human race meets its end in catastrophe, we're waiting and seeing. But it's an exciting time to be alive.
I'm quietly hopeful.
Yeah, and one of the things which a couple of people have said to me as I've been discussing this pyramid of human needs is there's several people who, amongst them Buddhists, amongst them people with a Hindu background, particularly some Christians, have said, well, this hierarchy is upside down. Transcendence should be at the foundation of it.
Well, I think that's because humans are purpose-seeking creatures. So without purpose, it's like, well, there isn't anything, is there?
No. Well, I would say that the bottom two levels of that hierarchy are non-negotiable. If you haven't got your basics of physical survival, you're not going to be able to transcend. I mean, as the joke goes, breathe in, breathe out. If you forget this, achieving enlightenment will be the least of your problems. Uh, but so you need your physical needs to be satisfied and you need to be safe. But once you have those in place, there's no reason why the next priority shouldn't be transcendence. And if it is, it's very interesting because if you look at those other levels, people who have aspirations to transcendence will not find it difficult to find friendship and love and affinity. They'll not find it difficult to have self esteem, and they'll not find it difficult to create things. And very interestingly, none of those really require money.
No, I mean, I was thinking as you were talking earlier that actually a lot of the activities that make me feel the most well, if we go back to wellness being tied to wealth, it's often not anything that does require money. It's spending time in nature. It's spending time with my family. It's being outside in the temperate months. It's basic stuff that I think we maybe take for granted.
And one thing I would just finally say is that over the course of the last 50 years, from my own observations, there's been more and more pressure against people finding time to do that. The working weeks are much longer. Most people spend a lot more time traveling to and from work, which is basically unproductive time, sometimes quite expensive as well. And
That may have reversed in the last couple of years, though. That issue of travelling time might have reversed, I think, in the last couple of years.
well, I certainly hope so. And of course, in most families, it's now necessary for both adult partners to be in employment. Whereas that was very much a minority option and a matter of deliberate personal choice. Okay, I think that more or less wraps up this topic, does it?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, yeah, very good. Okay, thanks for joining me, and we'll catch everyone on the next episode.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Sovereign Finance. For more episodes, transcripts, in-depth articles, and the community, please take a minute now to subscribe free at sovereignfinance.substack.com. See you next time.